So I recently acquired this new Gretsch Synchromatic Black Falcon. Now, the Synchromatic guitars, as you may know or may not know, are made in China. And this guitar is fantastic. Look at that beautiful binding. The finish is great. The fret ends are nice and smooth. It's a great playing, great sounding, and incredible looking guitar. And at $14.99, kind of an unbeatable value, especially with a hard shell case. It's great considering the Japanese version of this guitar is now pushing like 4K. But that isn't necessarily the topic of this video. What I wanted to talk about today is why aren't Gretsch guitars more popular? Most of the famous Gretsch models that we think about today all came out around the same time as Gibson and Fender were introducing their original electric guitar designs in the early 50s to mid 50s. Guitars like the Telecaster, the Stratocaster, the Les Paul, well, they all came out at the same time as guitars like the White Falcon, the 6120, and the Duo Jet. But certainly there have been 100 times more Strats, Tellys, and Les Pauls sold than there have a White Falcon or even a Duo Jet. So why is that? Well, I came up with 3 reasons why I think players don't embrace Gretsch in the same way that they do Fender or Gibson. Number one, there just aren't that many guitar heroes. So in the early days, people like Chet Atkins, Dwayne Eddy, Eddie Cochran, Cliff Gallup, well, they were amazing players and hugely influential. But that style of music began to fade and wane in popularity as the British invasion took hold. And the undisputed ambassador of Gretsch guitars these days that we all think of is Brian Setzer. But Brian Setzer is indelibly connected to rockabilly music, which honestly is kind of a niche genre. And many of the well known players who have played Gretsch guitars from time to time aren't really connected to the brand in the same way that someone like Jimi Hendrix or Stevie Ray Vaughan were connected to Fender and the Stratocaster. And while a player like George Harrison was hugely influential on many players, he played a variety of different guitars from Fender, Rickenbacker, Gibson, and Gretsch. The same for players like Neil Young, Stephen Stills, Billy Duffy of the Cult, John Frusciante of the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Well, they've all used White Falcons from time to time in their careers, and there's plenty of photos of them playing those guitars and recorded music of them playing those guitars. But they aren't strictly associated with Gretsch, and often many of those players are more associated with other guitars and other brands. And there's players like Tim Armstrong of Rancid, or Chris Chaney of The Living End, or Jim Heath of Reverend Horton Heat, or Poison Ivy of the Cramps. They've all made careers of playing Gretsch guitars. However, punk rock and psychobilly are niche genres. And arguably the biggest modern era player ever to be associated with Gretsch was Malcolm Young of AC/DC. Now, Malcolm made a career out of playing his battered 1963 Jet Firebird. And while he was in one of the biggest rock bands ever, he never gained the notoriety as a guitar player like his brother Angus did. And Angus was certainly more responsible for people choosing a Gibson, in particular a Gibson SG, than Malcolm ever was in getting somebody to want to buy a Gretsch guitar. And maybe you're saying, hey, what about Bo Diddley? Well, yeah, he was a famous Gretsch player, but his choice of Gretsch model was extremely unique and probably not a design that all that many players embrace, aside from maybe Billy Gibbons. But again, most of us associate Billy Gibbons with pearly gates. And lastly, a player like Martin Gore from Depeche Mode. Now, I reference him because, well, I dig Depeche Mode. But Martin Gore is more famous for being part of a huge alternative band from the 80s and 90s, more than he is being an influential guitar player. Number 2, oh, those guitars are for rockabilly or worship. The Gretsch guitar brand is super associated with rockabilly, western swing, punkabilly, and other subgenres of country music. Also, it's popular in the worship community as many players gravitate to the great chime of the Filtertron style pickups. And for that reason, I think a lot of players who aren't into those styles don't really consider Gretsch as a brand they're interested in. And Gretsch has definitely embraced and leaned into that heritage, which cements the association, I think, for most players. Number 3, those guitars aren't really very easy to play. The third issue I find is that many of the models that we instantly think about when we think about Gretsch guitars aren't necessarily the easiest to play. Take this Black Falcon, for instance. Although it's an ornate and beautiful instrument, it's big and very prone to feedback. But the same can be said for the slightly smaller and thinner 6120 models. Beautiful guitars, but ultimately they're prone to feedback, as are basically all of the Gretsch hollow body guitars that come to mind. Now, Gretsch, to their credit, have tried to address these feedback issues with center blocks in most of the models that they're making now, or at least giving players that option. However, it changes the sound of the guitar. And I think for Gretsch purists who are part of the niche genres we talked about earlier, they see this as a detractor because they absolutely want the correct features of the vintage models. And while Gretsch has actually made some thoughtful improvements in some of the Players Editions models, things like string through Bigsby's, locking tuners, pinned bridges, ultimately, aesthetically, the guitars look like the vintage ones. And that is a detractor for people who just associate the guitars with styles of music they're not particularly interested in. So it's unlikely that a lot of players will suddenly start to embrace Gretsch guitars, though they will always be a favorite of Chet Atkins style country jazz devotees, or early rockabilly pioneers, or the later rockabilly revivalists. It's equally unlikely that Gretsch will suddenly start to make new and more modern designs that stray from tradition. And you know what? Maybe that's okay. Gretsch is a household name for most guitar players and known worldwide, and they do have a smaller but devoted following. And as a Gretsch fan myself, I think they occupy a cool and unique space in the guitar ethos. They have a look and a sound that's unique to them that few other guitars can boast. And I think that everyone should try one, and maybe going a step further, have one in their collection because they do represent something really special. Okay, so now it's your turn. Tell me about some Gretsch guitars you've owned, or guitars you've played, or guitars you want to own. What do you love about that great Gretsch sound, or why do you not care for it? Comment below and let me know.